Sylvester, chapter 14. Halfway there. On the following morning, Phoebe found her grandmother in brisk spirits and very full of plans for the day. Foremost amongst these was a visit to the silk warehouse and another to her ladyship's own modiste. To dress you becomingly is the first necessity, child, said the dowager. The sight of you in that shabby gown makes me nervous. The prospect of choosing fashionable raiment was enticing, but Phoebe was obliged to beg her grandmother to postpone this programme. She had promised to show Alice all the most notable sights of London, and in particular to take her to the Pantheon Bazaar. She had a little difficulty in persuading the dowager to consent to any part of the scheme, for it did not suit that lady's sense of propriety to permit her granddaughter to wander about, seeing the lions, with no other escort than a raw country girl. She told Phoebe that Alice would enjoy herself more in the company of one of the maidservants, but was persuaded finally to sanction an expedition to the Pantheon Bazaar, having recollected that before she herself could persecute her various designs, she must write a letter to Lord Marlow and another to her daughter-in-law. Phoebe's own letter to her papa was already written, and she was able to frustrate the dowager's intention to send her forth in her town carriage by reminding her how much her coachman was likely to object to having his horses kept standing in inclement weather. Phoebe had a piece of very strict secret business to transact, and she by no means wished Lady Ingham's coachman to report to his mistress that her first port of call had been the offices of Messrs. Newsham and Otley, publishers. She entered those premises with high hopes and left them in a mood of such black foreboding as made it hard for her to enter into Alice's raptures at all that met her eyes. It had not occurred to Phoebe that it might be too late for her to delete from her forthcoming romance every mention of Count Ugolino's distinctive eyebrows, but so it was. Mr. Otley, confronted by a nameless lady in an ugly stuff gown who announced herself to be the authoress of Lost Heir, almost burst with curiosity. He and his senior partner had often speculated on the identity of that daring authoress, but neither of them had supposed that she would prove to be nothing more than a dowdy schoolgirl. His manner underwent a change, and a note of patronage crept into his voice. Phoebe's disposition was friendly to a fault, but she was quite unused to being addressed in just such a way by persons of Mr. Otley's order. Mr. Otley, encountering an amazed stare, hastily revised his first impression, and decided that it might be wise to call in the senior partner. Mr. Newsham's manner was perfect, a nice blend of the respectful and the fatherly. Had it been possible, he would have delayed publication gladly, and as gladly have incurred the expense of having the book entirely reset. But, alas, the date of issue was fixed, a bare month ahead, the edition fully prepared. Nothing could have been more unfortunate, but he ventured to think that she must still be pleased by the result of his labours. Well, she was pleased. So handsome were they, those 3 slim volumes, elegantly attired in blue leather, the 4 edges of the pages gilded and the title enclosed into a scroll. It didn't seem possible that between those opulent covers reposed a story of her weaving. When the volumes were put into her hands, she gave an involuntary gasp of delight, but when she opened the first volumes at random, her eyes fell upon a fatal paragraph. Count Ugolino's appearance was extraordinary. His figure was elegant, his bearing graceful, his air that of a well-bred man, and his lineaments very handsome. But the classical regularity of his countenance was marred by a pair of feline orbs, which were set beneath black brows, rising steeply towards his temples, and which were sinister in expression. Matilda could not repress a shudder of revulsion. Nor could Matilda's creator, hurriedly shutting the volume, looking imploringly up at Mr. Newsham. "I cannot allow it to be published." It took patience and time to convince Phoebe that it was not in her power to arrest publication, but Mr. Newsham grudged neither. His tongue was persuasive, and since he was astute enough to perceive that an optimistic forecast of the book's chances of success would only dismay her, he explained to her how rarely it was that a first novel enjoyed more than a modest sale, and how improbable it was that it would come under the notice of persons of ton. She was a little reassured, but when she parted from him it was with the resolve to write immediately to Mrs. Battery, imploring her to use her influence with her cousin to arrest publication. For his part, having bowed her off the premises, Mr. Newsham instantly sought out the junior partner, demanding, "Didn't you tell me that that cousin of yours is a governess in a nobleman's household? Who is he? Mark my words, that chit's his daughter, and we've got a hit." "Who is the fellow, I mean the real fellow, she wants to alter?" asked Mr. Otley uneasily. "I don't know, only one of them knobs," replied his partner cheerfully. "They don't bring actions for libel." It was nearly a week later when Miss Battery's letter reached her one-time pupil, and by then Phoebe, caught up in what seemed to be a whirl of fashionable activity, had little time to spare for her literary troubles. It was impossible to be apprehensive for very long at a time when her life had been miraculously transformed. Lady Marlowe's unsatisfactory daughter-in-law had become her grandmother's pet, and it was wonderful what a change it wrought in her. Lady Ingham was well satisfied. Phoebe would never be a beauty, but when she was prettily dressed and not afraid of incurring censure every time she unclosed her lips, she was quite a taking little thing. A touch of town bronze was needed, but she would soon acquire that. Miss Battery wrote affectionately, but not helpfully. More conversation than Phoebe with the more conversant than Phoebe with the difficulties of publishing, she could only recommend her not to tease herself too much over the remote possibility of the Duke's reading her book. Very likely he would not, and if he did, Phoebe must remember that no one need know she was the authoress. This was consoling, but Phoebe knew she would feel guilty every time she met Sylvester, and almost wished the book unwritten. After his kindness to have portrayed him as a villain was an act of treachery, and it was no use, she told herself sternly, to say that she had done this before she became indebted to him, for that was mere quibbling. The season had not begun, but that the unusually hard weather was driving a number of people back to town. Several small parties were being given. Grandmamma prophesied that long before Almac's opening night the season would be in full swing, and she wished to lose no time in making it known that she had now her granddaughter living with her. In vain did Phoebe reassure her that she did not care for balls. "Nonsense," said her ladyship. "But it's true, Mum. I'm always so stupid at big parties." "Not when you know yourself to be as elegantly dressed as any girl in the room, and very much more elegantly than the most of them," retorted the dowager. "But, Grandmamma," said Phoebe reproachfully, "I meant to be a comfort to you, not to go out raking every night." The dowager glanced sharply at her, saw that the saintly tone was belied by eyes brimming with mischief, and thought, if Sylvester had seen that look. But why the deuce hasn't he paid us a visit yet? Phoebe wondered why he had not too. She knew of no reason why he should wish to see her again, but he had asked her to tell her grandmamma that he would call on her when he came to town, and surely he must have reached town days ago. Tom, she knew, was at home, so the Duke could not still be at the Blue Boar. She was not in the least affronted, but she found herself wishing several times that he would call in Green Street. She had such a lot of things to tell him. Nothing of importance, of course, just funny things, such as Alice's various remarks, which Grandmamma had not thought very funny. Grandmamma had not taken kindly to Alice, and how Papa had written her a thundering scold, not for having run away from Osterby, but for having done so without first telling him where she kept the key to the chest containing the horse medicines. Grandmamma had not thought that funny either, and a joke lost some of its savour when there was no one with whom one could share it. It was a pity that the Duke had not come to London after all. In point of fact, he had come, but he had left again almost immediately for chance. One of the first scraps of news that had greeted him on arrival of Salford House being that Lady Henry was also in town with her child, staying with Lord and Lady Elverston. Since she had not mentioned to him that she had formed any such intention, this had made him angry. Her comings and goings were no concern of his, though she had no right to remove Edmund without his permission, but he thought it unpardonable that she should have left the Duchess during his absence and without a word of warning to him. He posted back to Leicestershire, but as he found his mother not only in good spirits but looking forward to a visit from her sister, he did not remain for more than a few days at chance. During his stay he made no mention of a visit to Osterby. The Duchess was left with the impression that he had been all this time at Blandford Park, and since he had straitly charged Swale and Cayley to preserve discreet silence, he was reasonably sure that no account of his adventures would filter through the household channels to her heirs. Just why he was reluctant to divulge to her an episode which would certainly amuse her was a question he found difficult to answer, and since a fleeting apprehension of this occurred to him, he did not tax his brain with it. After all, it could afford her no pleasure to know that he had passed the daughter of her dearest friend under review and found her to be unworthy to become his wife. In London he found quite a pile of invitations awaiting him, including a graceful note from Lady Barningham, bidding him, if he did not disdain, a small informal party to a little dance at her house that very evening. Now, Lady Barningham's daughter was the vivacious girl who came second on the list of 5 candidates for his hand. Having formed no other plan than to look at one or other of his clubs, he decided to present himself at the Barningham's house, where he could be sure of meeting several friends, and sure also that his hostess would accept his excuses for having left her invitation unanswered. He was right on both accounts. His arrival coincided with that of Lord Yarrow, who hailed him on the doorstep, and demanded where the devil he had been hiding himself. He found 2 more of his intimates in the drawing-room, and was received by a hostess who told him that his apologies were unnecessary. Indeed absurd, for he must know that this dance was the merest impromptu. What was one to do, Duke, in March of all the impossible months, and with London still so thin of company? "You've hit on the very thing, of course," he replied. "I have nothing to do but be glad I reached London in time to present myself, and was so fortunate as to escape a deserved scold. As though we were not well enough acquainted to dispense with ceremony. I warn you, you will find none here tonight. I perform no introductions, but leave you to choose whom you will for your partner, since I fancy you are all unknown to you." In high good humour was her ladyship, but careful not to betray her triumph to jealous eyes. With Salford one never knew, and a hint of complacence now would be remembered by the dear friends who were present. If he let another season go without making Caroline an offer, or offered instead for Sophia Bellaby or the lovely Lady Mary Torrington, it would not do to indulge optimism too far. She had done that last year, and his Grace had not come up to scratch, and however pleased he seemed to be with Caroline's company, no one could accuse him of making her his sole object. Not one of the 12 young ladies present would go home feeling that he had slighted her. 3 of them at least had enjoyed charming flirtations with him. She would have been dismayed had she known that Sylvester had discovered a sad fault in Miss Barningham. She was too compliant. He had only to lift his brows, to say, "You cannot be serious," and she was ready on an instant to allow herself to be converted. She was not going to argue with him. She knew his intellect to be superior. Well, if people, unspecified, supposed him to like that sort of flattery, they were mistaken. It was a dead bore. Not that he had enjoyed the party. He had spent an agreeable evening amongst friends, and it had been pleasant, after his experience in Somerset, to be welcomed with such cordiality. He wondered how he would be received in Green Street, and smiled wryly as he recollected what cause he had given his godmother to regard him with a hostile eye. But there was no trace of hostility in Lady Ingham's face or manner when he was ushered into her drawing-room. Indeed, she greeted him with more enthusiasm than her granddaughter. He found both ladies at home, but Phoebe was engaged in writing a note for the Dowager, and although she rose to shake hands and smiled at Sylvester in a friendly way, she asked him to excuse her while she finished her task. "Come and sit down, Sylvester," commanded Lady Ingham. "I have been wishing to thank you for taking care of Phoebe. You may guess how very much obliged to you I am. According to what she tells me, she wouldn't be with me today if it hadn't been for your kind offices." "Now, how without respect does one tell one's godmother that she is talking nonsense?" countered Sylvester, kissing her fingers. "Does Miss Marlowe make a long stay, ma'am?" "She is going to make her home with me," replied the Dowager, smiling blandly at him. "But how delightful," he said. "What a hoaxing thing to say," remarked Phoebe, hunting in the writing-table for a wafer. "You can't pretend you thought it delightful to endure my company." "I have no need to pretend. Do you think we didn't miss you abominably? I promise you we did." "To make a fourth at whist," she said, pushing back her chair. He rose as she came to the fire, retorting, "No such thing. Whist was never in question. Mr. Ord remained with us only one night." "What, did he take Tom home immediately?" "No, he left him with me while he himself went home to allay the anxieties of Mrs. Ord and your father. He came back 3 days later and bore Thomas off most regally in an enormous carriage, furnished by Mrs. Ord with every imaginable comfort, from pillows to smelling salts." "Smelling salts? No, no. I assure you. Ask Thomas if he didn't try to throw them out the window. Tell me how you fared. I know from Cayley that you did reach town that night. Were you very tired?" "Yes, but I didn't care for that. And as for Alice, I think she would have driven on for hours and still enjoyed it." "Oh, I must tell you that you have been eclipsed in her eyes, Duke." "Ah, have I?" he said, eyeing her suspiciously. "By a freak?" She laughed. "No, by Horwich." "Come, that's most encouraging. What did he do to earn her admiration?" "He behaved to her in the most odious way imaginable, as though she had been a cockroach, she told me. I was afraid she must be wretchedly unhappy, but I don't think anything she saw in London impressed her half as much. She confided to me that he was much more her notion of a duke than you are." He burst out laughing and demanded further news of Alice, but the Dowager said that rustics didn't amuse her, so instead Phoebe told him about her father's letter, and he incensed the Dowager by enjoying that hugely. Even less than by rustics was she amused by Lord Marlowe's fatuity. Sylvester did not remain for long, nor was he offered the chance of a tete-a-tete with Phoebe. The only tete-a-tete granted to him was the brief one with the Dowager, who found an excuse to send Phoebe out of the room for a few minutes so that she could say to him, "I'm glad you didn't tell the child she had me to thank for your visit to Osterby. I'm sorry for that, Sylvester, and think the better of you for having sent her to me, when I don't doubt you were feeling vexed with me. Mind if I'd known she'd met you already and not fancied you, I wouldn't have done it. However, there's no harm done and no need to think of it again. She won't, and you may depend upon it I shan't either. Now that I know her better, I see you wouldn't suit at all. I shouldn't wonder at it if she's going to prove as hard to please as her mother was." He was spared having to answer this speech by Phoebe's coming back into the room. He rose to take his leave, and as he shook hands with Phoebe, he said, "I hope we may meet again soon. You will be attending all the balls, I expect. I hardly dare ask you, if I really did cut you at Almack's, if you will stand up with me?" "Oh, yes, of course," she responded. "It wouldn't be very civil in me to refuse, would it?" "I might have known it," he exclaimed. "How could I be such a flat as to offer you the chance to give me one of your set-downs?" "I didn't," she protested. "Then heaven help me when you do," he said. "Goodbye, and don't grow too civil, will you? But I need not ask that. You won't."